Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to supply chain management, business continuity management, resilience, anything that helps you, your organization, prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we are going to be talking about vendor risk management and third-party risk management with a returning guest for her second appearance, Daniela Parker. Daniela, welcome back.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we just saw each other, met in person for the first time a few weeks back in Toronto at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference.
Yes, and it's always nice to meet people in person, right? When you're only
Yeah,
connected on Zoom or LinkedIn. So yeah, that was great.
yeah. And you gave a great keynote, so thank you so much for being a part of that.
Thank you.
Now, I know who you are. Can you refresh our memory as to what you do and how you got into what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, things have changed since the last time I was on the show. The last time I was here, I was the Chief Operating Officer for Resource One Credit Union in Dallas, Texas. I have since made the transition from working for an organization to working for myself. And so I am now the founder and CEO of Parker Solutions, and I work with organizations on improving their efficiencies, creating resilience. And then I also work with risk management professionals and coach them on how to get more buy-in, how to have that influence without authority impact on their organizations.
Well, congratulations on that. Well
Thank
done.
you.
Welcome to the land of the self-employed. Well, let's jump straight into our topic of vendor risk management and third-party risk management. And my first question is, aren't they the same thing?
That it is an interesting question, and I did a little bit of research on that. It's out, vendor management is really about how are you managing the vendors that you're interacting with, that you're buying services from, usually, software, that type of thing. And then third-party risk management is really all about how do you manage the risk that anybody you're involved with can bring to the table, like your partners, consultants, organizations that you engage with. How do you manage that? I like to look at it similar to how I talk about ERM, ORM, IRM, all those acronyms that are out there. To me, it's like just manage that risk and call it whatever you'd like. But it's about managing really third party risk, and vendors are included in that, right? So vendor management may be a subset of your third party risk management.
And how far does that go? Just out of curiosity, because there's so much talk about, don't just look at your vendor, look at your vendor's vendors.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So part of your vendor risk management is really not just the third parties anymore, fourth parties, fifth parties, right? Because every vendor has a vendor usually, and then they sometimes have vendors as well. So definitely on the vendor risk management side, understanding how deep that goes is critical.
And that's got to be confusing too at times because um, there are so many different pieces to look at. If I'm just looking at my main supplier, ABC Inc., and yet they're dealing with 20 people, and then we have to break that down. How do you manage that? How do you evaluate your vendors and partners? That's got to be a big process.
Well, so I base everything on risk, right? It's all depending on the risk that they bring to the organization. And so outside of looking at how many dependencies the vendor itself has, we look at, organizational impact. How much impact does this vendor actually have on your organization? What's the financial value of the contract? Are they supporting a business continuity critical function? That should be part of your assessment process. And then how does the process actually work? Having worked in financial services, the main concern is usually around data, right? Understanding when you send a third party your data, are they sending it to someone else? And then is that fourth party also sending it to someone else? So really mapping out how does that vendor perform what they're doing for you and what are the dependencies? And it can go pretty deep. It's surprising how deep it goes, but again, everything's connected, um, pretty complex, so to speak. And so really taking the time and looking at not just the vendor, but really saying, how are they delivering what they're delivering to you and who supports them? and then really understanding how deep you have to go.
I'm going to ask you in a moment just specifically how we go about doing that. What should we
Yeah,
ask and look for? But you mentioned data
yeah.
and evaluating that, and I I couldn't help but think that doesn't that conflict with information security and cyber teams who are doing the same kind of an evaluation?
Well, depends on how your organization is set up, right? So usually in my past, that was a very close-knit relationship. And for me, vendor risk management starts before you even do your vendor due diligence. It really starts with your project management, right? When you're even in the RFP phase, really, you should already be thinking in the back of your head, what are some of the requirements you have, especially working in a regulated space where there are certain expectations. It starts way before your vendor management team is really involved. And frankly, they should be involved from the get-go. But, back to your question on how that works with InfoSec, those two should be very much working together on, understanding the data flow. And then again, if your information security people are conducting vendor due diligence, that's fine if that's how your organization is structured, but that's just one component. So, if there is a vendor risk management team, then they need to get input from the InfoSec folks. Also understanding that when you look at a vendor, you look at the vendor. You look at how is that vendor performing? Do they have all the necessary documentation? Do they have their SOX? How are their financials? Are there any lawsuits? What you're not necessarily diving into is how are they actually interacting with your organization? And that's where, for me, always the InfoSec and the technology folks came in. So then understanding, how are they processing your data? And for what can we do from an internal mitigation perspective to help mitigate some of the risk that a third party could bring to the table?
I like what you said there at the RFP phase as well, or
Hmm.
request for information, or whatever acronym somebody likes to use.
Yeah.
But in the project management piece too, I guess that if you can bring your security teams and your information security teams and all the others that are normally involved, if you can bring them in together,
Yeah.
then I guess that's going to help with evaluating later on down the road.
Oh, it's huge. And I have seen this so many times where I'm brought in literally at the time of contract signing or sometimes after contract signing. People are like, here, I signed a contract. And I'm asking, who did the due diligence? Oh, can you do that now? And we're like, well, the contract is signed, right? So ideally, bringing in your vendor management, however that's structured in your organization, your vendor management, your InfoSec folks, your technology folks in at the very beginning, it will save so much time for the entire project. And again, understanding that they're not there to say no, usually they shouldn't be. They're really there to make sure that you're successful, right?
Right.
And you're protecting the organization and you're ensuring that you understand who you're actually getting in business with.
I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here because I couldn't help but think of it when we were talking project management, and then we
Yeah.
start going through some of these assessments, which we will get to. I will ask you how to do that.
Yeah.
Uh, how do you handle a situation when you want to evaluate different vendors, but you have executives or a vice president or somebody with a preferred vendor already in mind? Do you still
Oh,
do that evaluation, or do
yes.
bow down and say, yes, ma'am, we will get you what you want?
Well, again, depending on your organization, right? In some organizations, the bow down probably happens. But if you're in an organization that understands the concept, and if you're in a regulated industry, it's easier as well because you can say, hey, per regulation, we can't just sign contracts. But at the end of the day, I've been in situations where the vendor due diligence came back with concerns. The contract came back with concerns, right? Because don't forget about the contract piece. So it came back. And at the end of the day, I don't own that risk as a risk manager or as a vendor risk manager. That's not my risk to own. So whoever owns that contract relationship or that process, that product, they have to understand, what's the risk that they're taking on, and that's my job to tell them, here's the concerns, here's the impact of that. And then here are potential mitigations, right? Because ultimately we want to mitigate something or we transfer the risk, we have insurance. But at the end of the day, if they're okay with that and it isn't outside of your organization's risk appetite or violating a regulation or a law, that's on them. It's just going to be documented.
I thought I'd get your thoughts on that because I have been on quite a few projects or programs where a senior executive has said, "Yeah, we're going to deal with such and such," and I know no evaluation has been done because you start working with them, and then little things start coming up,
Yep.
out of the woodwork, and it's like,
Yep.
now what do we do?
Yeah. And it happens a lot, right? I've seen this too, but at the end of the day, it's not your risk, right? And if it's within the appetite and if it's not illegal or violating a regulation, sometimes you just have to let it go. As long as you did your job and explained to that contract owner or the relationship owner what it is that you're concerned about, and you offer up some options. I have very rarely have I seen people then go against it, right? If you can really outline what the potential impact is and that you can offer up some mitigation or solution, then a lot of times people aren't willing to, just put their neck out for it because it is documented. There's, things like risk acceptance memos. There are all these tools that, protect me as a risk manager, protect the organization, but at the end of the day, it's not my risk.
I can't help but think of use some basic project management skills here. Capture your
Absolutely.
risk, document it, and you're right.
Yep.
As a PM, you don't own that risk.
Yep.
Somebody else does.
Yeah. And again, in the same, on the same token, it's like understand your stakeholders, right? Bring them all to the table early on and not when you're ready at the end. It happens to, I'm like the risk management discipline, the compliance folks are usually not brought in early enough. Business continuity. I mean, every vendor that you bring, there has to be an assessment, especially if they support a critical function. So who's asking the business continuity folks how they feel about this? And again, bring them in early so that you can assess all of that and then mitigate or address what you need in the process rather than at the very end when then you have the speed bumps, right? Then it turns into you can't do that or did anybody think about this? And then it's a big surprise.
And then you end up with products changing and services changing, um, sometimes to meet what the vendor can deliver. And they're actually
Yes.
not delivering what you really want them to.
Well, and that goes to the whole, do you actually have a problem that you're trying to solve, or do you just like the shiny object, right? Because I've seen that too when people are like, well, this vendor here has a really cool tool.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then I'm like, well, what's the problem we're actually trying to solve? Well, I don't know, we'll find one, right? But we're getting this really cool tool, and then it turns out that maybe we should have evaluated that a little better. Yeah, all that's all part of it.
Yeah, I've seen that happen too. Oh, they've got this shiny product. It looks great, so let's use it. And some of these are big name service providers. Well, just because they're big name doesn't mean they have exactly what you need.
Yeah, and that's I hear that all the time too. It's, big names. And the same for vendor due diligence. It's, well, they're well known. Okay, that doesn't mean that we don't have to conduct vendor due diligence. There may not be any wiggle room on the contract negotiation or if we want anything special, but at least we have to understand what we're getting into. And I think that's key when it comes to the large vendors. At least understand what you're taking on, see what you can mitigate internally and then see what you can transfer and understand it, right? It's the whole, just because they're a large vendor, we're not going to just blindly go into this relationship. And I see that too, you know.
Do you think sometimes complacency sets in because sometimes you are working with a big, well-known vendor or service provider that, oh, they're that big, so they must have all this in place. And then assumptions start creeping in, yeah, they must have this, they're big.
I don't know if it's complacency or maybe it's just a lack of understanding that it's not like we haven't seen large vendors have cyber incident or downtime or, I think it's really a lack of understanding and then also a lack of understanding the purpose. Again, right? Like you're not just necessarily looking at the vendor itself, you're also trying to understand the impact that the vendor can have on your organization if they're not performing. And that can happen to large I mean, SolarWinds, right? That was a large vendor. Microsoft with their update not too long ago that wiped out, that was Microsoft.
Yeah.
So, it happens.
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking today with Daniela Parker about vendor risk management and third-party risk management, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.